This is Professor Kinney, and today we're looking at doing facial feature mergers between two subjects. And the main focus is going to be on using a technique called layer masking and another one called adjustment layers to accomplish that. I'm going to use my own photograph, which is sitting on the desktop, and I'm going to merge it with another photograph. This one I'm going to find on the web. One thing about looking for pictures on the web, quality becomes an issue. You want to have a shot which matches the axis of your face, that has a similar lighting scheme, that in other words it's lit from the same directions with basically the same quality of light. You want to work with a large format image, so if in Google image search you select show options, you can ask it to show only large images, and because we're working with color we can also specify the filter for full color. So in looking at these, you'll notice at the bottoms you're given a pixel count. You want to make sure that the smallest number here doesn't dip below 600. You want a lot of image information. You want to make sure that the image has a good dynamic range of color, going from highlight to shadow. Avoid anything that's too contrasty, because this of course will create problems when trying to match images. If we look, we've got one here, and just because there's a lot of pixels, it doesn't necessarily mean that that image is of good quality. But if you look here, this image has highlights, it's got shadow, and it's got a good healthy range of tone in between. So I'm going to use this high-res image, drag it to my desktop right beside mine. It's Richard Purdy, and here's the two images, and I'll drag them both onto my Photoshop icon. That will launch the software. We want the two images to be more or less the same size in terms of the number of pixels, but we're probably going to find that there will be some disparity. It's always best when working with images in Photoshop to avoid sizing. If you have to size an image, you're better off sizing down the way than up the way. That way you're not asking Photoshop to make up pixel information. Right now we've got two separate files. I'm just going to tear my image off. Notice I drag it, it creates two separate windows. Now, using the Move tool, I'm going to drag my image over top of Richard Purdy's image. Now look at that. There's a huge discrepancy in terms of file size. The Richard Purdy image has a lot more image information than mine, so it causes a downsizing. Just going to get rid of this layer for a second. You can see it. If we go to image size, you can see, just look at it in inches. This is about 7 by 9 at 72 pixels per inch. Let's compare the Richard Purdy headshot. Image size in inches. If we were to convert this to 72, just like my image, this image is 18 by roughly 27 inches high at the same resolution. So there's an obvious disparity, and it comes from the total number of pixels. Look at his image, 1296 by 1936, and look at my image, 640 by 480. Therein lies the disparity. So I'm going to downsize his image. My image is actually too small. I'd have to retake that and make sure that the smallest dimension in my image was no less than 600. So maybe an 800 by 600 image would have been more appropriate. But in this case, I'm going to downsize Richard Purdy. So this is a case of do as I say, not as I do. Notice the difference in the file size. There's the layer for Richard Purdy's image, and there's my image in the background. If I double click the lock and click OK, it unlocks the background layer. Now what I'm going to do with Richard Purdy's image is scale it down. So I do this, first of all, I will zoom out, use my zoom tool with the option key, zoom that image out a fair bit. And then if I use the Edit Free Transform or Command T, you can see that it gives me the scaling handles for his image. I can scale him down, and if I hold the Shift key, it constrains the image. He's still too large. And I'll keep scaling that down until the heads are roughly the same size. I'll double click it when I'm happy with the transformation, and it commits to that scaling. Now, it would be much easier for me if in the Layers palette I set the opacity to about 70%. And that way I get to see both images simultaneously. You can see my eyes and Richard Purdy's eyes simultaneously. What I'm trying to do is get them to match up. I also want to make sure our heads are on the same level too. So I would use the eye lines and the line of the nose to ensure that the two heads were more or less equivalent. So I'm fairly satisfied with how that's lining up at the present. Now I can bring Purdy's face back up to 100%. And what I can do here is use the frontmost image as the basis for cropping the entire image. So what I'm going to do is just going to use the rectangular marquee tool, select this area here, and then say Image Crop. It crops my underlying image to match Richard Purdy's. Let's take a look at this now. I'm going to put my image on top. I'm going to set my image to be semi-transparent. And you can see that the mouths don't match up. That's to be expected in a lot of cases because everyone's facial proportions are quite different. And so I would expect that to be the case. We may have to use multiple iterations of my head to fill in parts of Richard Purdy's face. But if we take a look at this, set it back to 100%, we're now going to bring my face in gradually over top of Richard Purdy's. And to do this, we're going to use the technique of layer masking. If I go to Layer and choose Layer Mask, Hide All, it generates what's called a double exposure. But you'll notice that it's not adding my image to that double exposure because this black plate is here, effectively masking out my image, preventing it from contributing to the double exposure. You'll notice if I click on the image, it's highlighted. If I click on the plate or the mask, it's highlighted. It's very important that you've got the mask highlighted and not the image. Now in doing that, you'll also notice that the color palette, if I move this out here, the color palette is grayscale. If you have the image selected, the color palette will either be CMYK or RGB. Notice the difference. The other thing you will notice is in your Channels palette, at the Channels palette, when you click on the mask, it highlights the mask. When you click on the image, it highlights the composite red, green, blue. So again, make sure you're on the mask. I'm just going to close this for now. And now I'm going to paint the mask in with a paintbrush. I can use my right arrow to enlarge, or left bracket, right bracket to enlarge or reduce the size of my brush. I can choose the type of brush that I want to use. I'll just reduce that a little bit. It's got a soft edge to it. And now I want to make sure that I'm painting in white. Because what I'm going to be doing is actually punching holes in this mask area right here. So as I paint in white, you'll notice that it is bringing my facial features in and merging them with Richard Purdy's. So those are my eyes that are overlaid there. You'll notice that there's a fair discrepancy between my skin tone and his. I can also bring in my nose instead of his. And I'm okay with that for now. And if I wanted to bring in my mouth, that would be a little bit problematic given the location of his beard and the fact that my mouth resides much higher up. This creates some obvious problems in terms of matching those features. So I'm just going to undo that, and I'll deal with the mouth parts later. First of all, what I want to look at is the actual mask itself. And if I turn the mask on, you can see the red is for the opaquing, and it's clear we're allowing the image to show through. I'm going to switch off the RGB image, and this is our mask. Now you'll notice that I've been painting in white with a softened edge. If I paint in a color other than white, let's say at 25% black, when I paint in these areas, what I'm actually doing is showing a percentage of the underlying image rather than showing it at 100%. Let's take a look at what that looks like on the image. So it's allowing for a transition of these images. If I paint at 50%, it shows both sets of eyes showing through. And we can see some of his nose and some of my nose. Now we can use this to a good effect in order to merge the skin tones and the skin textures. Because, as I like to say, Richard Purdy looks a heck of a lot older than I do. He's got a lot of grooves in his skin, but my skin's too baby-like compared to his. So we need a kind of overlay of both of these skin types in order to make the merger more credible. So I want to paint in underneath my skin some of his texture and some of my smoother texture over top of his skin texture, just to create a more credible merger. And we can do this by painting at 50%. The darker I get, of course, the more of Purdy's skin I'm bringing in to mine, as you can see here. We're merging both, and we still require some matching of skin tones. These are fairly close, but I can bring in a little of my skin tone and merge it a little bit with his, and it just helps address the imbalance between those two images. And now finally, again at about 50-50. We're merging the two. So we're creating a more believable merger of the skin tones. I still need to create some color balance. And the way in which we do this is by using Layer, New Adjustment Layer, and there's a whole variety of different color corrections that we can use. For this one, I'm just going to use Color Balance. And what that does is it lays in an icon for the color adjustment plus a mask. You'll notice this mask is clear, so it's going to apply the color change to the entire image. So here's the adjustment, and I can add in more red or add in more blue, and you notice it's doing it to both images. However, if I hold the Option key down, you notice the interlocking circles appear, and if I click on the boundary line separating the color adjustment from the uppermost image, if I click that, it indents and underlines this here, indicating that the color adjustment will apply only to this image. So we've made it a local layer-specific color adjustment. So now if I start to add in red, you'll notice it's only doing it to my image. Or if I remove the red, it's doing it only to my image. So you can see, particularly around the cheek line where the two images meet, if I pull out some of that red, it allows for a more seamless transition between those two images. Likewise, I may want to enrich the color of my eyes, in which case I could do another color adjustment. So let's go to Layer, New Adjustment Layer, and I'm going to use Hue and Saturation. I could probably have achieved the same result using a color adjustment or color balance, but I'm going to use a different one. Again, Option click so that it's specific only to my image. Now the thing is, I don't want it being applied to the entire image, so I'm going to fill the mask with black. The best way in which I could do that would be to say Edit, Fill, and use black. Fill, black, and there it is as a solid black. So in this case, there it is in solid black. So now, in this case, I'm only applying the color adjustment to the eyes and nowhere else in the image. So I'm going to zoom in to this area, and I'll use a space bar and move along here. And I just want to paint in where the eyes are. So in this region only, I'm going to paint in white. So if I go here, and I just paint this region, any color change that I make will only be applicable to this region here. And likewise, we'll move over here, paint this in as well. Now you'll notice that the mask has this barely perceptible area here that will allow the coloration to be applied to the eyes, as you can see here. Let's go back to the image, and with this mask selected, I can now apply the color adjustment, and I can change the hue. You'll notice the color of the eyes. I can boost the saturation in that area and adjust the color, and you can see the color of the eyes shifting. And just zoom in. And so as we go through the spectrum, you'll notice the eyes and nothing else is changing. You can boost the lightness or increase the darkness in that area. and turn the eyes to another color. So again, boost the saturation. You don't want to take the saturation too far. In this case, I'll just colorize. And let's zoom out. And you can see the dramatic adjustment in the eyes. So we use a technique of masking in conjunction with a layer adjustment to give very specific local adjustments to color. We use the layer masking technique to combine the two images, and now we would save that. And we would save it in the native Photoshop format to retain all of the layering properties. And I'll just name this Kenny J _ merger. And I would save that file, and then I would be ready to employ that file in a layout that showed the two starting images and the final merged image. And that's covered under the podcast on PDF workflow. Thank you.